Manifest Destiny. During the first half of the 19th century, the United States population witnessed a near five-fold expansion due to high birth rates and a rising tide of immigration from Europe. Combined with the economic depressions of 1819 and 1839, westward migration exploded as Americans searched for new land and opportunities. In response, President Thomas Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase from France in 1803, which doubled the size of the United States, followed by the acquisition of Florida from Spain in 1819. By the time Texas gained statehood in December of 1845, the notion that the U.S. would inevitably expand to the Pacific Ocean had become so widely accepted in the minds of most Americans, setting in motion a flood of migration and political will into what would become the American West. The term Manifest Destiny first appeared in an editorial published in the Democratic Review in the summer of 1845, when a writer made criticism of the lingering opposition to the annexation of Texas from Mexico, urging readers toward a national unity for the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. That same summer, an article by John O'Sullivan in the New York Morning News referenced manifest destiny in light of the Oregon Territory, which was another vast swatch of land which American politicians and laymen alike were eager to assert control over. By the time the Oregon Territory joined the U.S. following a treaty with Great Britain, America was now embroiled in the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, which was driven by the spirit of manifest destiny as pioneers freely encroached upon Mexican land. When war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 525,000 square miles were added to the United States land holdings, including what is now California, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. While the conquering spirit of manifest destiny witnessed a near stunning territorial expansion over the first half of the 19th century, the unrelenting westward spread of Americans not only led to war with Mexico, but also witnessed the wanton mistreatment and dislocation of Hispanics, Native Americans, and other non-Europeans living in the path of westward settlers, at the same time fueling a contentious two-sided debate over which new territories and states would embrace the brutal institution of slavery, eventually leading a divided nation headlong into civil war. Milk sickness. During the early 1800s, pioneer settlers to the Midwestern frontier were terrified by a baffling disease, which progressed from weakness and lassitude to vomiting, coma, and death, indiscriminately felling frontier settlers during the warm summer months, including Abe Lincoln's mother, Nancy. Initially called the slows, the staggers, or the trembles, milk sickness, as it eventually became known, was recorded nowhere else in the occupied United States, taking thousands of lives from 1809 to 1927, prompting the state of Kentucky to offer a $2,000 reward, some $80,000 in today's currency, for anyone who could determine its etiology and cure. While many nervous settlers suspected spooks and witches as the cause of the disease, even poisonous vapors emitting from the earth, settlers abandoned entire regions of the Midwest, including the Wabash River Basin, in Indiana and Illinois. The real cause began to emerge once Anna Pierce returned to the Rock Creek area of southern Illinois after completing nursing school in Philadelphia. And as her practice expanded into nursing, dentistry, and midwifery, Dr. Anna, as she became known, nursed untold patients until their passing from milk sickness, including her own mother and sister-in-law. noting the seasonality of the disease. Anna suspected that cows were consuming some sort of poison, since they too were routinely felled by the disease. Determined to solve the mystery, in 1834, Anna began tracking cattle through woods and fields, recording everything they ate. Stumbling upon an elderly Shawnee woman who was hiding in the forest to evade her people's forced migration to Kansas. When the elderly woman learned of Anna's purpose for being in the woods, the native instantly pointed to snake root as the cause of the disease. Anna quickly began a campaign of awareness to local settlers in a 100-mile radius, who in turn eradicated the plant from southeastern Illinois over the next 3 years. Given the male-dominated bent of a nation before equal rights for women, the world of science failed to acknowledge Anna's accomplishment, even to this day, making Anna Pierce Bixby an unsung hero in frontier medicine. Sacagawea. Although details about much of her life are limited, Sacagawea was born into a Shoshone tribe near present-day Salmon, Idaho, sometime around 1788. At age 12, Sacagawea and several other young Shoshone girls were kidnapped during a deadly raid by Hidatsa warriors, before being sold into a non-consensual marriage to French-Canadian fur trapper Toussaint Charbonneau. Thanks to diaries and letters of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, before, during, and after their now legendary trek to the Pacific Ocean and back, their combined penning details the hiring of Sacagawea's husband, Charbonneau, as their translator, before venturing westward from their winter encampment at Fort Mandan. Sacagawea's mastery of the Shoshone or snake language proved to be of critical importance during their arduous journey west. Nicknamed Janie by Meriwether Lewis, Sacagawea and her 55-day-old son Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, nicknamed Pomp by Clark, became in many ways more important to the expedition than Charbonneau himself, since the presence of a woman and a child in the party, as Clark wrote, reconciled all the Indians as to our friendly intention. A woman with a party of men is a token of peace. After her quick thinking saved important supplies when her pirogue capsized in bad weather, both explorers praised her action by naming the Sacagawea River in her honor, while her ability to communicate with native tribes along the way allowed the Corps to barter successfully for fresh mounts and supplies. Because of her knowledge of the Rocky Mountains, in July of 1806, Sacagawea advised the explorers to cross into the Yellowstone River basin at present-day Bozeman Pass, which later became the optimal route for the Northern Pacific Railway's eventual path across the Continental Divide. After the expedition ended, Sacagawea and her young family spent 3 years living with the Hidatsa people, before accepting an 1809 invitation by Clark to settle in St. Louis. Following the birth of her second child named Lizette, Sacagawea passed away on December 20th, 1812, at the tender age of 25, following a protracted battle with typhus. According to Missouri Orphans Court records, her children, 10-year-old Pomp and 1-year-old Lizette, were formally adopted by William Clark on August 11, 1813, making Sacagawea a short-lived yet vital asset during one of the greatest journeys in American history. The Sand Creek Massacre. After the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, made lands north of the Arkansas River to the Nebraska border, the exclusive domain of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. The treaty broke down when gold was discovered in the Colorado Territory in 1858. By 1859, more than 100,000 Euro-American fortune seekers, known as 59ers, had poured onto Native American lands, ushering in a precipitous rise in hostilities by 1861. In an effort to curb the violence, on February 8th of that same year, Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle and several Arapaho leaders accepted the terms of the federal government's Treaty of Fort Wise, granting them 600 square miles of protected land to include a substantially reduced reservation along the Arkansas River to its northern boundary at Sand Creek. In June of 1864, Governor John Evans of the Colorado Territory, along with Colonel John M. Shivington of the U.S. Army and Fort Leon Commanding Officer Major Ned Wincoop, encouraged Black Kettle and his people to move their village to Sand Creek. Instead, in a bit of open treachery against Native Americans, at sunrise on November 29th, some 675 U.S. volunteer soldiers under Shivington's command attacked Black Kettle's Sand Creek encampment of some 750 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, employing small arms and artillery fire that slaughtered many of the villagers, particularly non-combatant women, children, and the elderly. Many who survived the initial attack fled across a dry creek bed and up a small rise, where soldiers shot at them as they struggled over sandy terrain. Those who managed to crest the small hilltop frantically dug pits and trenches to protect themselves, which drew further artillery fire over the next 8 hours, leading to the deaths of some 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people. The following day, soldiers returned to the site of the massacre, committing further atrocities on the dead, before departing on December 1st to resume their campaign. In 2000, copies of letters from Captain Silas Soule and Lieutenant Joseph Kramer were found in Denver, offering first-hand accounts of the massacre, which revealed that more than 100 men of the attacking U.S. volunteer soldiers stood in moral resistance to their orders, making the Sand Creek Massacre one of the darkest days in Native American history. Shootout at OK Corral. Following the Arizona silver strike of 1877, Tombstone quickly grew into one of the richest mining towns in the American West, attracting the likes of Doc Holliday and the Earp brothers, Wyatt, Morgan, and Virgil, to the bustling and sometimes lawless desert community, along with outlaw cattle rustlers, thieves, and murderers like the Clanton and McClory brothers. A former Dodge City peace officer, Wyatt worked as a bank security guard, while his brothers Morgan and Virgil were Tombstone marshals. And when Ike Clanton and Tom McClory rode into Tombstone for supplies on the morning of October 25, 1881, the two cattle ranching outlaws had multiple violent run-ins with the Earps and Doc Holliday. Itching for a fight against the law and order brothers of Tombstone, the following afternoon, Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, and Billy Claiborne rode into town to round out the Clayton-McClory gang. And when the new arrivals strode into a local saloon for refreshments, Holliday was more than happy to inform them that their brothers had both been pistol-whipped in a fight with the Earps. Vowing revenge for their brothers, the five-man gang met up at OK Corral at the end of Fremont Street, and when the Earps and Holliday spotted the gang around 3 p.m., the now famous gunfight at OK Corral exploded into a 30-second fusillade of gunfire. While historians continue the debate about who fired the first shot, Sheriff and eyewitness John Behan of Cochise County testified that Virgil Earp drew his sidearm and shot Billy Clanton point blank in the chest, while Holliday did the same to Tom McClory with a shotgun. Wyatt then shot Frank McClory in the stomach, while Frank and Billy managed to squeeze off a few shots before collapsing, wounding Virgil, Morgan, and Holliday, before Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne fled for the hills. After Billy Clanton and the McClory brothers died from their injuries, in the aftermath to follow, Sheriff Behan initially charged the Earps and Holliday with murder until a Tombstone judge found the men not guilty a month later, ruling that their actions were fully justified in committing these homicides, making the shootout at OK Corral a high-water moment in the storied annals of Wild West folklore. the Bear Flag Revolt. During America's westward expansion, under her growing allegiance to manifest destiny, European American settlers began a steady march toward the Pacific, leaving residents living in the Mexican province of Alta California with a rising sense that their own government was too poor, unstable, and weak to staunch the flow of foreign invaders. At the same time, beginning in 1835, Americans like Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston led a rebellion in present-day Texas against Mexican rule, culminating 11 years later in the independent nation of the Republic of Texas, which in turn sparked the Mexican-American War of 1846, after land-grabbing President James Polk annexed Texas into the United States. 9 months before war broke out in earnest, President Polk sent John Fremont, a captain in the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, on an expedition to survey the Great Basin and the Great Salt Lake, at the same time secretly instructing the explorer and future politician to invade California if war was formally declared against Mexico, conveniently sending Fremont with a howitzer just in case. Entering California in December of 1845, Fremont and his men skirmished with Mexican authorities, and when Fremont learned that war had at last broken out with Mexico, on June 13, 1846, he entered the Sonoma Valley with a ragtag group of settlers who had grown fearful that Mexican authorities would oust them from their land. After imprisoning Mexican General Mariano Vallejo at Sutter's Fort, the general quickly offered up his terms of surrender. Upon Vallejo's bloodless capitulation, the Americans announced the foundation of the California Republic, hastily stitching together a flag with a lone star and a grizzly bear that comically looked more like a hog than a bear, raising the flag over the barracks at Sonoma to announce the newly minted independent nation of California. Known as bear flaggers or bears or osos in the Spanish, Fremont and his men engaged in further skirmishes with Mexican forces, while on July the 7th, the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet, under the command of Commodore John Slout, seized Monterey, immediately claiming California as part of the United States. 2 days later, the Bear Flag Revolt ended when, for the most part, the marauding would-be revolutionaries came to their senses. California would ultimately be ceded to the United States in 1847 under the Treaty of Cahuenga, making the Bear Flag Revolt one of the most comical events in American history. Today on the Daily Dose, the California Gold Rush. On January 24, 1848, James Wilson Marshall, a carpenter originally from New Jersey, found flakes of gold in the American River at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains near Coloma, California. At the time, Marshall was working to build a water-powered sawmill owned by John Sutter, and as Marshall later recalled of his historic find, "It made my heart thump, for I was certain it was gold." Though Marshall and Sutter tried to keep news of the discovery under wraps, word got out, and by mid-March, at least one newspaper was reporting that large quantities of gold were being turned up at Sutter's mill. By mid-June, some 3/4 of the male population of San Francisco had left town for the gold fields, and the number of miners in the area reached 4,000 by August. As news spread back east, potential fortune seekers remained skeptical at first, until President James K. Polk addressed a report by Colonel Richard Mason, California's military governor. The accounts of abundance of gold, Polk wrote, are of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by the authentic reports of officers in the public service. After Polk's pronouncement, the race was on in earnest, as mostly male fortune seekers borrowed money, mortgaged their properties, or spent their life savings to make the arduous journey west. Thousands of would-be gold miners, known as 49ers, traveled overland across the mountains or by sea, sailing through the Isthmus of Panama or even around Cape Horn, the southernmost point of South America. By the end of the year, the non-native population of California was estimated at 100,000 people, compared with 20,000 at the end of 1848 and around 800 at the beginning of 48. To accommodate the needs of the 49ers, gold mining towns sprang up across the region, complete with price-gouging shops, saloons, brothels, and other business owners seeking to make their own gold rush fortunes. The overcrowded chaos in the mining camps and towns grew ever more lawless, including rampant stealing, gambling, prostitution, and violence. After 1850, the surface gold in California had largely been exhausted, even as would-be fortune seekers continued to arrive. As gold became more and more scarce on the surface, the growing industrialization of mining drove many fortune seekers from independence into hourly wage labor. The new technique of hydraulic mining, developed in 1853, brought enormous profits to mine owners, but destroyed much of the region's landscape in return. Though gold mining continued throughout the 1850s, it had reached its peak by 1852, when some $81 million was pulled from the ground, leveling off to around $45 million per year by 1857. Settlement in California continued, however, and by the end of the decade, the state's population topped out at 380,000 non-Native Americans, making the California Gold Rush a steady driver during America's push for westward expansion. And there you have it, the California Gold Rush of 1849. Today on The Daily Dose, get your nerd on with The Daily Dose and learn something new every day. Subscribe to The Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com. The Chinese Exclusion Act. Following the Opium Wars against Great Britain, China's crushing war debt, combined with a protracted stretch of floods and droughts that left many Chinese peasants seeking new opportunities abroad. Many Chinese found their way into California after James Wilson Marshall's 1848 discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill. Combined with another devastating crop failure in China, some 20,000 Chinese immigrants passed through San Francisco's Customs House in 1852, up from 2,716 the previous year, igniting a racially charged spree of violence by whites who saw the Chinese as a threat to their ongoing ability to earn a living wage. Later that same year, in an effort to curb the violence and allay the fears of white miners, California imposed a foreign miners' tax of $3 a month, despite the fact that Chinese laborers worked for less money and longer hours than whites, often given the most dangerous and backbreaking jobs in a given mining operation. To worsen the plight of Chinese immigrants, the 1854 Supreme Court case of People v. Hall ruled that the Chinese, like African Americans and Native Americans before them, were no longer allowed to testify in an American courtroom, further limiting their ability to seek justice against the rising flood of white-inspired violence. During construction of the first transcontinental railroad, after Charles Crocker and other founders of the Central and Southern Pacific Railroads placed employment ads for white workers, when only a few hundred white men applied, Crocker began hiring less expensive Chinese workers to fill the labor vacuum. Before the tracks came together at Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10, 1869, some 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese laborers had almost single-handedly built one of the greatest engineering achievements in American history, working from sunup to sundown 6 days a week, all for $26 a month. Signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur, on May 6, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act furthered the nation's racist tenor by suspending all Chinese immigration for a 10-year period, at the same time excluding Chinese Americans already in the country from seeking naturalization as U.S. citizens. And while Chinese Americans challenged the constitutionality of the law in court, all of their efforts failed to bring about justice. The immigration ban was extended an additional 10 years thanks to the Geary Act of 1892, followed by the Immigration Act of 1924, which extended the nation's exclusionary practices to not only the Chinese, but other undesirable groups such as Hindus, Middle Easterners, and the Japanese. Chinese immigration into the U.S. plummeted as a result, until the Magnuson Act of 1943 at long last made Chinese Americans eligible for U.S. citizenship.